Staying in Contact. I'm London Mitchell. In this installment, another walk down memory lane. We are going to take a look at the history of radio broadcasting in Toledo, and it may be a lot more than you think. My longtime friend and broadcasting colleague, Lou Hebert, and I have partnered on a project to recap Toledo's long love affair with wireless. We have initiated a new website to take us on that historical and nostalgic journey through Toledo radio, ToledoRadioHistory.net. So, Louis Bear, it's about time to go way back to the beginning.
Toledo can be called the cradle of radio broadcasting, without a doubt. I know the story of Lee DeForest and Frank Butler, early pioneers and the experimenters, back before there was such a thing as radio broadcasting, and they were doing experiments in Toledo. And it was, I believe it was Butler who suggested that radio be the term that we would call it. Before that, it was called wireless telegraphy. We're talking now 120 years ago, right? Where it started was Toledo, Ohio. There, Lee DeForest is many people think Marconi is the father of radio or Tesla, but actually, when you come down to voice of radio, now there was telegraphy, telegraph, wireless telegraphy, and I think Marconi and Tesla both have argued over that. But when it comes down to voice and putting voice over the air, that's Lee DeForest and Frank Butler. I don't think there's any question about that.
And those early experiments with sending voice over the airwaves happened here in Toledo.
Yeah. 1907. That's how far back. 1907. Yeah.
And I think as people wander through our website here, they'll learn that the first land to sea communication, I believe, was from our area, as well as the first radio dispatched police cars.
Right
here.
Exactly. And that land to sea was, just so people know, and they may be familiar with it, if you've been to Put-in Bay, there is a sign, an Ohio Historical Commission sign that commemorates that. And then that was DeForest and Butler again. And that was during the famous Mills race, the Mills Trophy race at Port Clinton and Put-in Bay. So that's where the first voice communication happened between land and sea. And that was recorded back, I think, also in 1907.
And I think that many people would say, wow, that's pretty interesting. But I remember radio back in the late 50s, early 60s. And probably most of the people that will be visiting this website are boomers. And just a piece of nostalgia for you and I think this is the first time we've done anything jointly in the way of radio since back in the early 70s when we were on WTTO together.
That's right.
Doing the morning show. Right. Yeah, long time. But for those who remember radio back in the early 60s or mid 60s when we were in high school, I think there's a lot of nostalgia. Many of us remember the names that were on radio, a lot of them inspiring ourselves to get involved, to think of radio as a career.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And I think that if you talk to almost anybody in radio, at least of our vintage, they'll go along with that same notion. And I remember I got a transistor radio when I was a kid in the early 60s. I think 60 or 61 is when I got my first transistor radio, and it was like magic, because you could, at night I would tune into all these stations all across the country and disc jockeys and listen to WLS in Chicago and Dick Biondi and WCFL in Chicago, KYW in Philadelphia. There were just, you could listen, you could tune in the world at night on AM radio and hear all of these voices. And that definitely inspired me to want to go into radio in some way. And I ended up becoming a ham radio operator. And And then I was always fascinated by the magic of radio, because it's, you think about it, it's like somebody said to me a long time ago, they said, it's like, it's invisible, it's up in the air, and all of a sudden it's in your ear. It's like, and it comes from thousands of miles away. It's almost like a magic trick.
And we called it the skip. And
Yeah, the skip, right?
most people don't listen to AM radio anymore, but at night, boy, you could pull in those faraway stations and, yeah, KMOX and WLS. That
And,
was
and if we were really lucky and the skip was right, you could get KOA in Denver. So that was once in a while you could pick them up at 85, 850. But, closer to home, I remember listening at night to, I had also started with a crystal radio. And so the only station you could hear on a crystal radio where I grew up out in Genoa was WSPD, which had the biggest signal at night. And I remember listening to Art Berry and People's Opinion. So, that goes back a few years.
some of the radio personalities that really jump out at me from those early days. Larry O'Brien, John Gary. A few years later on, the Mojo Man, and as we have some recordings of interviews that I've done with other personalities getting into the later 60s, Buddy Carr. Then we got into rap back in the 70s
Right. The
on
WHO.
WHO.
Excuse me one second, London. For our younger viewers, we're not talking about rap music. We're
No,
talking about rap being a talk show. RAP, rap, was a talk, because that's what you used to say in the early 70s to be hip. It wasn't, hey, let's chat, let's rap.
that's true. That was a big gamble, I think, for WHO radio to abandon the rock and roll music and go to all talk. But it paid off for a lot of years. And rap was on WOHO 1470. And there was also WTOD at 1560.
During the 60s and early 70s, especially the 60s, it was sort of the mecca of local rock and roll as far as the rock station. That's where you said you talked about John Gary and let's see, Lee Fowler. There was Larry O'Brien, there Bill Webb, and of course Bob Kelly and Bob Martz, and a whole host of others whose names and people that we have been lucky enough to work with in subsequent years.
As you wander through the website, you are going to experience a lot of those personalities, and especially Bob Kelly. I mean, there's somebody that you and I both have worked with over the years, and we have a recording of his induction into the Ohio Broadcast Hall of Fame, which is wonderful, and it is what do I want to say? Grassroots Bob Kelly when he makes his speech, his acceptance speech. Funny story about Bob Kelly, I will tell you. And after you had worked with him as his newscaster,
Mm-hmm.
that I was able to join him in the studio. But years before either one of us worked with him, he was the morning disc jockey on WTOD. My cousin was visiting from England. She wanted to see an American disc jockey in action. And I went with her over to the WTOD studios out in the middle of this field out in South Toledo. He invited us in that Saturday morning and into the studio, and he was very cordial and very welcoming to her, allowed her to read the weather in her British accent. While we were in the studio just chatting with him, in walks the newscaster, a guy named Bob Zurich, sits in this big overstuffed chair in front of the control board, or on the opposite side of the control board from Bob Kelly, and he starts reading the news in this big, gruff newscaster voice. And as he gets to the point where he is reading about a local fire, Bob Kelly reaches over the control board with his cigarette lighter and sets fire to the copy. And so there he is reading the news. His copy is on fire. And as he's reading, he's dropping page by page onto the floor, stomping out the flames with his foot. Finally, there's no more copy left in his hands to read. He signs off, Newsbeat, gets up out of his big chair, walks out of the studio, never breaks an expression, just walks out like it's a normal everyday occurrence. I'm
Maybe
standing,
it was.
I'm standing awestruck against the wall of the studio saying, you got to be nuts to want to work with this guy. You know?
Yeah, that was an old trick that was done. I had that done to me once on the air many years ago in Iowa when I was working there. And the only thing you had is your back in those days, of course, at least in Iowa, all we had was a cough switch. Because we had an engineer controlling all the controls, so all we had was a cough switch. So if you wanted to break for a second and talk to somebody or say stop it, hey, what are you doing? I mean, you had to hit that cough switch. That was about it. That was your only escape. And yeah, I think I'm not sure that I handled it as with the same coolness as Bob Zarek when that happened to me the first time. I was 19 years old and fairly new in the business, and it was a good initiation. But I think I started laughing and couldn't stop all the way through reading the obituaries.
Well, that's the kind of fun thing that I think was going on in radio behind the scenes that kind of gave it a life that I'm afraid we're missing today. Kind of that I don't want to call it an inspirational spark, but certainly those ad libs made it sound like it was a whole lot more fun.
Well, it was, it was fun. Radio was fun to listen to, and there were some great personalities, and I think there still are. But I'm not sure that we have the room for the great personalities that we did, and that was one of the cool things about radio. And as spent 50 some years in doing radio and television, but I found with radio, is you never knew you worked with so many great people, so many great personalities, and you never knew where they were going to end up or how it was. Um, what somebody always said, in a market like Toledo, which was never a huge market, but it was sort of a medium market. They said, in Toledo, you're either working with people on their way up or their way down. So, and that might have been the case. I certainly had that experience myself, but you did, and you didn't know whether somebody was going to end up the next year selling cars or they were going to end up in Chicago. Doing, becoming, world or nationally famous. So it was cool. It was a lot of fun.
The address for our new website is ToledoRadioHistory.net. It's now live, but also a work in progress. I'm London Mitchell. That's our program for this week. Please join us again next week as we continue staying in contact.
Previous installments of Staying in Contact with London Mitchell are available on Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Podchaser, the Stream 419 app, and londonmitchell.news.